Welcome to the International Labor Day edition of the podcast on the spot. My name is Jovan Jovanovic. I'm a former Serbian ambassador to Indonesia and ASEAN, a former member of Serbian parliament. And today's topic is a protracted political crisis in Georgia. And I'll discuss this issue with Irakli Porchkhidze. He's a co-founder and vice president of the Georgian Institute for Security Studies, and he is also former dean of the State University School of Law. So, Irakli, thank you again for being my guest.
My pleasure. My pleasure to be here once again with you.
Yeah, so last time we spoke, it was just before the general election in October last year, and unfortunately, many of your fears came true. So I would appreciate if you can give us like an overview of this last 6 months after the elections and the ongoing protests, more than 150 protests in the last 6 months. And what were the major events? And also we see like last week that the chairman and two-time prime minister from the Georgia Dream Party, he resigned and he left politics, former Prime Minister Irakli Garibashvili. And what has been the government's response to the protest? Because we can see introduce the policies that restrict civil liberties, freedom of assembly. You have political prisoners, political trials, etc., etc. So the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much for being interested in what is happening here in Georgia, because I think what will happen in Georgia will definitely going to be something to look at from other regions and other countries. And I think that there are certain lessons learned, or let's say some interesting developments that might be of interest to the Serbian audience and to others who are interested about democracy. So, as you rightly mentioned, I mean, there was a pivotal election which took place parliamentary election, which took place in October last year. And ever since that election, basically, we have a standing political crisis in Georgia, which lasts to this day. Well, what happened is lamentable because Georgia was on a track to be integrating with the EU because we were granted the status, I mean, the member status of EU, and we were about to actually, if conducting the elections in a proper way, to open the chapters of negotiation with the EU. Unfortunately, the way things unfolded are in the other way, which means that Georgia is no more regarded as a let's say as a candidate to move forward with that at the moment. So what happened is that the elections were conducted in a fraudulent way, and they didn't actually emanate trust inside the Georgian population, and also, of course, when it comes to the international community as well. So there were many problems with the way it was conducted, but also with the way the results were announced. And what happened is that the opposition didn't recognize the election results because the general mood in the public was that the government should lose. But of course, that was not what the government was thinking about. They just used all the mechanisms to thwart any opposition to their plans. So what happened was that, of course, since then, the opposition is boycotting the parliament. So the opposition didn't enter the parliament. Actually, they relinquished their seats, which were won by the popular vote. And right now, they don't take part. There is only one party, which is also regarded to be an opposition party, which is still inside the parliament, but they don't take part in the sessions and they don't take part in the work of the parliament.
But they take money from the budget.
Yes, and they were saying that they're doing that because they simply don't want to be dependent on the oligarchs who are outside the politics, and they want to have something which they deserve because of the popular vote, etc., etc. But they don't take part in the work of the government. So there are four parties, the opposition parties, who entered the parliament, which don't take part. Well, of course, it was followed by the popular protests. The protests were very large in numbers. It was above 100,000, which is very big for a country of 3 million, as you can imagine. So the numbers were actually shooting all the way up to 200,000, mainly in the capital of Georgia, which is Tbilisi. Well, of course, the government was very let's say, I mean, we don't have a democratic government anymore, so it's an authoritarian government. So they use all the methods which are there for the authoritarian governments to use. So they crack down on their protests. Of course, they use different means. And this time they were actually way more bloodier and the way more reckless with the way they were doing it. Of course, they've done it in a way which creates a menace to actually expressing your opinion nowadays in Georgia. So what they've done is that they've mobilized the groups of people. Unfortunately, they don't have the so-called name, the numbers or you cannot recognize who they are. Sometimes they are regarded to be not actually people employed by the police, but also it was alleged that they are the ones who are unofficially or informally gathered by some of the government-linked people. So they can be bouncers, they can be people from the different other government agencies, but not representing the law enforcement. So what they've done is that they're cracking down on the protests. They're beating people severely. They're trying to torture them while they're taken to the custody. They're trying to not only torture, but also belittle them in any way possible. So that's actually dishonoring them in a way possible. So this is a widely practiced deed of the government. But what they also do is that they are trying to basically increase the fines for gathering outside the parliament, let it be, or in any other place. So it has become more and more reckless and more oppressive. So the beatings, this authoritarian practice of increasing the fines, the so-called chilling effect to the democratic means of expression. So not being able to come out, and if you are speaking up, you are met somewhere, close to your house and beaten severely by people who are masked, not knowing who they are. They're also mobilizing some parts of the Georgian population as they're claiming, like some legitimate, let's say, concerns which are in the other part of the population. They're trying to kind of create this tension inside the population, which are, of course, absolutely artificial. They're just trying to gather people. Like sometimes these are drug addicts, some criminal affiliated people, and they're trying to basically target those who are openly coming out in the public and trying to protest of what is happening in Georgia. So
Sounds
that
familiar.
is actually. Yes, so they're using this tactic, and of course, apart from that, they're also trying to bombard the civil society, but also everyone who is pro-democracy in Georgia with the new legislation. So they've introduced now the third volume 3 of the so-called a la Russian legislation, which basically is a registration of foreign agents, meaning that anyone who is trying to be opposing to the government is labeled as a foreign agent, and they're trying to be smeared. And there is this huge barrage of propaganda against them. They've also introduced the new penalties. So basically, if you are coming up to the streets and they deem that, there are no proper numbers, in the streets there, you are taken to the court and you are fined by 5,000 lari, which is almost $2,000 for just one time, let's say, protest that you are participating in. So they've been actually increasing the volume of people who are punished. So there's this chilling effect. They've also increased the so-called administrative detention terms. So it was maximum of 15. They increased it to the 60 days, etc. So they're basically creating this. Well, basically, it's a criminal punishment nowadays, as if you are committing some kind of a crime. So everything which is linked to democracy is being persecuted one way or another. They're also trying to start and open the investigations into various types of actions, as they are calling. For example, 2 days ago, they were raiding the people who are associated with this so-called funds, which are the funds or the financial means for people contributing to support those people who are in prisons, for example, or the ones who are trying to support the logistics of the protests. So they're raiding them, they're going to their homes in the mornings and just doing it in an obscene ways, with more than like 100 people rushing to a place, like these people, some of them masked, some of them in black suits, and etc. I mean, just to intimidate. So there is this fear and intimidation in the air here in Georgia. But what authoritarian governments do is that they're trying to increase the price of dissent. So of any type of democracy works. So I'm pretty sure that you are witnessing some of that in Serbia as well, but not only there. In any part where you have this so-called Russian playbook, there is this subtype of actions which do associate with the ones which are here in Georgia. What also they do is that they're trying to limit or basically cut off any resources. So they're trying to block the funds. They're trying to fire those people who are pro-democracy and pro-Western, let's say in Georgia, from their public positions. So they are cleansing the ranks. So right now, what you have in Georgia is a total onslaught on a democratic part of Georgian society, which is not small. It's a majority right now. So they're trying to punish everyone who is linked to any type of expression of dissent. And of course, what they're trying to achieve is to create this so-called squeezing out effect on the dissent from the public discourse. They don't care if you are going to be dissenting among your friends, in the kitchen or inside your house, but the dissent should not be voiced in public. And that's their raison d'être. That's what they're doing, and they're continuing to do it, with the means that I've explained. So it's dangerous nowadays in Georgia, because if you are not pro-government, or if you're not neutral, let's say, in the way they want it, you are a target. So one day or another, you might be a target. And of course, as a result of these problems, we also have the political prisoners. So now we have people who are more than 60 people, young people, most of them, who are now in the prisons, and there is no due process nowadays in Georgia. It's actually funny. We have a circus. It's not even, this has nothing to do with justice. This has nothing to do with law. These people are just held as hostages. So we call them political prisoners / hostages, because they're hostages of the government.
Yeah, so you mentioned also this third volume of this Foreign Agent Act. If I'm not wrong, now there is a requirement from the government approval in order to receive foreign funds. This is the latest.
Yeah, well, that's a different law, and I will explain that those are amendments to the law on grants.
Okay.
And that's a different thing, and I'll try to explain that to you as well. So, as I said, one of the tactics or the methods that they are using is the barrage or the bombardment of authoritarian legislation. So they're basically changing the legislation, making Georgia less democratic, or like on a weekly basis. So it's very difficult for the civil society, but also for other actors to actually get hold of it, because it's very fast, and they are doing it in high volumes. So with this, the third volume of the law, they're just trying to rebrand it. They're calling it American FARA. So there is, so now they're just trying to kind of use this marketing trick. Oh, we just copied whatever the US has it. So nowadays you will not be able to say that, it's Russian, it is US. So you basically won't have anything to do with we don't have anything to do with any pro-Russian legislation. What, of course, in essence, it's a lie, that nothing has changed, even though they've copied it. They still have the articles there, which basically try to demonize anyone who might one way or another being linked or receiving money from outside. So they are called to be foreign agents of influence. And nowadays, they've actually increased the scope of the law. So it's not only about the organizations anymore, it's also about the physical or the natural persons. So it's also about individuals. So it's not only organizations, but for example, if you are receiving, if you have a contract, a consultancy contract with any foreign organization, if they deem so, and if they want so, if they want to target you, they will call you a foreign agent. And also they've expanded, and of course, what they're going to be doing is that they're trying to be targeting the ones that they want to target. So they will be selective in doing that. And it is already creating a chilling effect because some of the organizations, they don't want to be anymore involved in this. So their aim is to basically carve any type of resources going to the dissenting organizations or personalities. They're trying to cut off funds going to the people who are voicing concern about the policies and about the way that Georgia has been developing this and the previous years. But the second legislation that you have mentioned is the legislation which is actually going beyond that, and it's mind-boggling to even think about it. So basically, this new amendments to the law on the grants is obliging any foreign donor to address the government, to receive the permission to even fund someone. Because it was very difficult for them to roll out the previous law, the law on foreign agents, because people were not complying. And when people are not complying, it's very difficult to implement that law. So now they've shifted the burden to the donors, foreign governments, or the aid organizations. And this will take effect, I think, on the 20th of May. So as you understand, the laws are becoming more and more draconian, which means that after some time, the foreign governments will not even be interested to provide any aid to Georgia because it's going to be too cumbersome, but it's also going to be about cooperating with the authoritarian government. And at the same time, it will actually result in people not having any funds, being deriving from the external sources. So nowadays, the government is trying to stymie any possible democratic voice inside the country. They will also start to target now the so-called the academic institutions or the universities, because that's going to be the next target, because they still think that there are the aisles of let's say freedom still remaining there, and this public space, yes, then that public space should also be monopolized by the state power. So what we are going to be having is actually the squeezing out of any dissent from the public discourse. And of course, that's lamentable to see, because Georgia had this amazing opportunity to be moving forward closer to EU. Georgia was having such a great momentum to be a thriving democratic state, but nowadays Georgia is a grim place, where most of the people are in disarray. Most of the people want to fight, but there are less and less means to fight. But also there are a lot of people who are actually leaving Georgia. So the government has been doing all of this because they want the dissenting part of the Georgian population to leave the country. So you have this brain drain, and it's unfortunate that, of course, as you understand, these are the most let's say productive part of not all of them are the most productive, but majority of the people who are living are the majority of those representing the most productive part of the Georgian population. I mean, intellectually, but also as a labor force, because those are able people, who just have a different type of political opinion. And it's unfortunate that, Georgia is having a bad time in terms of people leaving our country.
And maybe just a last puzzle to this situation now. How about the media landscape in Georgia? Are there any islands of free press?
Yes, we still have the media. We have a TV media which is still there. Unfortunately, the one media just closed today because the government basically pulled strings with one of the let's say, owners of this Tavari news channel. Tavari was the biggest opposition TV channel. So they basically, with the hands of the owner, closed down this opposition media. There are a few others as well. Of course, they're not as resourceful and they were not as popular. But nowadays, people will start to switch to this TVs. But they have a let's say smaller reach, and the media is getting more and more squeezed out. And of course, they do have problems with the funding, so their resources are extremely limited. So you can imagine that, there is a big discrepancy between the media landscape, which was here like 2, even 3 years ago, and what we have right now, because the pro-government TV channels and outlets in general are much more well-resourced. They have the bigger audience, and then you have the opposition or dissenting media, which is having hard times, and they're also decreasing in numbers.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned that the opposition doesn't participate in the parliamentary sessions, but do they do anything beyond that? And what is the state of the opposition now? Are they divided, unified? Are they supported by the citizens who are protesting? Because we have this problem in Serbia of the credibility of the opposition. So is there a similar situation in Georgia?
Well, that's an unfortunate reality that the opposition is still fragmented, so they don't have the unity. They also lack, let's be very frank, the leadership. So they don't have a lot of leaders who actually find traction with the larger parts of the population. You also have a problem of resources, because these organizations, the political organizations, are not well resourced because of the state of where Georgia is, which is very limited availability of free funds, which are not controlled by the government. And at the same time, they do have a problem of setting political agenda. And that is something, of course, that the government is trying to capitalize on, the so-called government right now. But we have to understand that is what is happening when there is an authoritarian state. Because in authoritarian states, you have less and less viable choice. Why? Because you have the situation where the being on the other side is bearing higher costs. So there are people who are co-opted, there are people who are banished from the politics, there are people who are leaving the country, there are people who are scared, and they are the ones who are also not as good of material for a political life. So you understand that, in a way, this uneven field, the uneven political field, is in favor of authoritarian governments, because they're squeezing out the dissent, they're increasing the price for dissent. So what you have is exactly what we have right now, which is a problem with an alternative choice. Mm-hmm. But that is the function of authoritarian states. That's what happens in authoritarian states. And that's what they do. That's what they did in Russia when they obliterated opposition. That's what they did in Belarus. That's what they do it here. And you name it, in any other country.
Yeah. So what has been the reaction of the major foreign powers to the situation in Georgia, both bilateral and multilateral? From the EU, some EU member countries, for example, introduced some bans and sanctions on some of the members of the Georgia Dream regime.
Yeah.
The Council of Europe, the Parliamentary Assembly of Council of Europe adopted a resolution on the situation in Georgia last week. So what?
Yes. Yeah, basically following the elections, let's be very clear, there are two baskets of countries which have had a reaction to what is happening in Georgia. The ones who are neighbors of Georgia, Azerbaijan, Armenia, Turkey, they have recognized the election results here in Georgia. Because they don't really care too much about what is happening when it comes to Georgian democracy. Let's be very frank. China has recognized the Georgian elections. So you have this kind of the types of regimes or types of the governments that would go along. Why? Because there is a lot of practical need to cooperate with Georgia, and of course, strategically, for example, Azerbaijan needs to have Georgia on board. Why? Because there is this the transit which goes from Georgia to Turkey, and Georgia has a function there. The same is with Armenia, because Armenia is a landlocked country. It's having not a very good relation with the other neighbors. So Georgia is one of those conduits to the Black Sea. So these countries actually have recognized the election results, and they've congratulated the government. The same is with Turkey, and as I said, the external players such as China. But the rest, the ones who used to be the Georgian allies and the ones who actually were anchoring Georgia into a different space that Georgia was trying to strive and move forward to, which was the kind of the Western institutions, let it be the EU or the Council of Europe or the relationship with the US, the strategic relationship, you have a kind of a cold shoulder given to the present government. What it means? First, it means that they haven't recognized the elections officially, which means that they're trying to cut down any high-level contacts with the government, so no high-level political contacts. These things remain very technical, and most of the times they don't want that to be publicized, so they're not publicizing it. So there is no political flair to that relationship. Apart from that, of course, there have been many declarations which have been and the statements which have been adopted by the European Parliament, let it be, or by the Assembly of the Council of Europe, condemning what has happened in Georgia and calling on the Georgian government to go back to democratic ways. And of course, there is this list of what they are trying to demand from the Georgian government. And what we have right now is also the sanctions imposition, because some of the players have actually imposed the sanctions. The United States, for example, imposed the sanctions on the oligarch or the shadow leader of Georgia right now, who is basically behind all the decisions of the government and who is the puppeteer, who is basically moving all the puppets around the government, including the so-called prime minister. So Ivanishvili is on the U.S. sanctions list right now, him personally, not his companies yet. And of course, there have been some dissimilar sanctions, not on him, but on other members of the government, and also on the so-called law enforcement bloc, as well as judges, also from other European countries. So the individual European countries have put them on the sanctions list. Most of them are actually put on so-called visa bans, or they're not allowed to have visas, or they're trying to kind of limit their ability to enter their countries. But there are some financial sanctions as well, which are not as comprehensive, of course, and that's lamentable, and not as many people are on those sanctions lists. Usually it takes time for the sanctions to take, let's say, effect, but also for the sanctions to be introduced. So right now, there is a big talk about some of the players whose sanctions will be very important to be targeting those who are right now making the moves or the actions in the Georgian government. And of course, one of those is the British the British sanctions list, because it's extremely important for many reasons. So we will see. I mean, Brits have introduced some sanctions, but they're not yet financial ones. But it's not only about the people who are inside the government. It's also about their accomplices outside the government. And of course, you have the so-called, as we call it, quotation mark, big businesses, the ones who are kind of the cronies of the government, the big businesses who are moving money, who are receiving money from the state. So we have to understand that it's kind of a syndicate. And this syndicate is moved by the interests of the so-called state actors. And those people are the ones who are winning all the tenders and procurements. Those are the ones who are getting the good land plots. You can imagine all kinds of privileges that these people are getting. Some of the government members are also invested in those companies. So you have to understand that you have this very intertwined interests, which are right now here in Georgia. So we have to understand that the sanctions are also there, coming from the international actors.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned the U.S. administration sanctions to Ivanishvili, and there are some, especially congressmen, who are very active and vocal about the situation in Georgia, especially Representative Joe Wilson, and he introduced a bill on countering effects of the China Communist Party, the Iranian regime, and the Russian Federation. So, if you can just briefly say something about that, and what is the role of Iran and China and Russia, of course.
Well, there are some American congressmen and the ones who are actually trying to lobby the pro-democracy movements and not lobby, but to support the pro-democracy movements outside United States, the ones who have been vocal supporters of what is happening in Georgia. Well, the sanctions have been introduced by the Biden administration. They've not been introduced by this administration. So this voices, in the Congress are the ones who are actually also sponsoring this Megobari Act. The Megobari in Georgian means friend, so it's kind of the Friend Act, which wants to support the Georgian pro-democracy movement, but at the same time they are trying to support democracy in Georgia. Basically, it's about that. And of course, it also calls on the Georgian government to act properly when it comes to being a democratic state, but it also calls on the US government to introduce sanctions on those people who are trying to undermine Georgia. But apart from that, of course, they also talk about the problems related to the relationship that Georgia has. Some of the times the government in place, which is here in Georgia, has been vocal anti-Western actor. So they've been actually trying to undermine the Georgian friendship with all the countries except few which are not particularly democratic. So these bills are also targeting those who are acting undemocratically. So we have to understand that all those players that you have named they're not the democratic players, and they're not the actors which are democratic. So basically, these acts are pro-democracy. They're supporting the democratic movements, and at the same time, they're trying to counter those interests which are anti-democratic. So, of course, it derives from the regime type that we have just discussed, and it's unfortunately that Georgia has been aligning with these countries. Georgia has been bashing our allies, our long-lasting allies of 30 years. For the past 2-3 years. It's just amazing the way they have been barraging and them with all this propaganda, anti-Western propaganda. They've been basically causing up to Russia. They've been establishing the so-called strategic partnerships with China. Now Georgia has a strategic partnership with China. They've been causing up with Iran. They've been trying to cozy up to Iran and get closer to Iran. They've even attended they have attended the funeral of the deceased president of Iran together with Hamas leader. They were standing together with them, and of course, for the rest of the world, that was kind of a red flag. And it was the first time Georgia actually appeared with such actors as Hamas in the same place, standing shoulder to shoulder with them. And it was just amazing to even see that. So for a lot of governments and a lot of people in those states, they understood that this government is not just about some opportunistic actions. It's actually much more. It's about the change of the nature of the regime which we have here in Georgia.
Are
So
there also
those
calls for
bills,
joining BRICS?
well, there haven't been talks about joining the BRICS, but because no one is interested about Georgia, frankly, joining the BRICS, because we're not a big economic mover anyway. But of course, politically, this hasn't been discussed because we're not particularly. It's not a politically viable option for this government as
In
well at
Serbia,
the
we
moment.
have these calls. Even some officials are talking about that. So, since we have only a
Yeah.
couple of minutes left, I would appreciate if we can finish with your opinion on what is the way forward and how this crisis should and could be resolved.
Yeah. So basically, now the demand of the opposition and the demand of the pro-democracy protest is to release the political prisoners and that has been a big problem, of course, nowadays. It's also about continuing the boycott of the parliament because no one recognizes the legitimacy of this, the parliament. It's also about the imposition of the new sanctions because they want to increase the price for those who are, cooperating with the regime, but also those people who are inside the regime, because some of these business interests, they're wary of their of their financial interests. So with sanctions, that's going to be a big thing, and they definitely don't want that to happen. And I'm pretty sure that pushing for this new sanctions is extremely important. We also have to look of what is happening in the Ukraine, because what is happening in Ukraine will define what kind of uptick the Russian interests will have in the region and beyond, because many of the authoritarian actors in the region or non-democracy or anti-democratic forces are looking up to what is going to be happening in Ukraine, because this government that we have here is openly basically betting on Russia to win. So they've been very comfortable with the situation so far. So we have to understand that whatever will happen in Ukraine and the way the peace might be reached or the way things will unfold one way or another will define also how the mood will change here in Tbilisi. But I'm also sure in Hungary, that it be, or in Belgrade, or in many other countries, because if the West will be able to be resolute and the pro-democracy forces will be able to sustain and maintain the traction with the reality and talking from the position of strength, that's going to be extremely important. But anything alternative is not going to be perceived the right way. So I think that but we also have problems. And the problem is that, as the time passes, it's more and more difficult to mobilize the masses. It's more and more difficult to have the proper resources for people to come out. It's getting more and more difficult to actually sound dissent. So for example, the Serbia, it makes a lot of sense for the political opposition to unite, to push for let's say, a political agenda which will find traction with a lot of people, having leaders, the leaders of the protests. Because nowadays in Georgia, unfortunately, we have no political leaders who are leading the protests. It's a civic movement, which is great in itself, but it also creates the problem of that not being channeled politically.
Yeah. We have the same problem here in Serbia, by the way. It's a mostly civic student-led protest. Well, hopefully both countries will overcome this political crisis and they will return to the democratic path and EU path. And thank you so much, Irakli, for sharing your deep insights and being open as always, and sharing with us this authoritarian playbook, which is applied not only in Georgia but in other authoritarian countries. So thank you so much and good luck with your struggle.
Thanks a lot. And it's always great to be here with you and talking about this. And I would like to wish good luck to you, to Serbia, and also to Georgia, and to all pro-democracy forces around the world.
Thank you again.
Thanks a lot.